Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a truly fascinating piece of history. When we think of nationalist heroes or the architects of a people's identity, we usually picture generals leading a cavalry charge or loud oratories giving fiery speeches on a grand stage. But today, we're looking at a completely different kind of revolutionary. We're going to explore how a quiet, meticulous secretary in post-war North Borneo used the seemingly mundane tools of ledgers, meeting minutes, and carbon copy correspondence to legally and culturally legitimize his entire people. His name was Richard E. Yap. And this brilliantly illustrates our core theme for today. We always hear that history is written by the victors, right? Well, this story proves that sometimes history is actually written by the person controlling the paperwork. Whoever holds the pen, writes the minutes, and files the official correspondence ultimately controls the future because they're creating the permanent record that institutions are absolutely forced to recognize. Part 1. A World in Ruins. Let's step back in time to late 1945. World War II has just ended, leaving a civilization completely hollowed out by the Japanese occupation and the subsequent Allied bombings. Into this crucible of absolute ruin, a young Richard Yap had to figure out how to rebuild. To really grasp the sheer scale of this devastation, consider this number: 614. Out of the 890 government buildings that existed in North Borneo before the war, 614 were completely destroyed, wiped out. The infrastructure was gone, the economy was extinguished, and the British chartered company that had previously ruled the territory was bankrupt. By 1946, the region became a British crown colony, and the new administrators inherited a traumatized population and a landscape reduced to ashes. Part 2. The People of Ya. So, who exactly was this young man stepping into the void? Yap was Sino-Kadazan. This meant he had a Chinese father, whose roots lay in the commercial, Hakka-speaking trading networks, and a Kadazan mother, deeply rooted in the indigenous, spiritual, and agricultural life of the Panampam Valley. Both legally and socially, he was caught right smack in the middle of these two very different worlds. Imagine the stark contrast between these two realities. On one hand, Yap's Kadazan heritage was a world of soil and spirit. It was guided by the oral traditions of the Bobolian priestesses, women who memorized thousands of lines of sacred chants. It was all about communal reciprocity and the sacred rhythms of the rice harvest. But on the other hand, the British colonial world was one of paper and ink. It was governed by ledgers, written laws, and these highly rigid racial categories that frankly had absolutely no idea what to do with a mixed heritage Sino-Kadazan boy. Yap became a cultural bridge, kind of trapped between a fluid oral tradition and a rigid categorized empire. Part 3. The Colonial Classroom. So how does a boy from a rural village learn to navigate the British Empire? Well, it started in the colonial classroom. Yap attended a British mission school called St. Michael's. Now, the primary goal of these schools wasn't exactly to foster independent thought. It was to mold native children into reliable, literate subordinates, clerks who could serve the colonial administration's needs. And this required a complete mental rewiring. The school actively worked to replace Kadazan time, which flowed naturally with the seasons, the sun, and the rhythms of the harvest, with British time. Suddenly, the school bell and the clock dictated the day. Punctuality became a strict, enforceable discipline, demanding absolute precision from the students. Think about their curriculum. They were drilled in English, reading and writing, practical arithmetic, how to properly format official correspondence, and meticulous record-keeping. The colonial state wanted predictable, accurate clerks. But, and here's the part that perfectly foreshadows his future, this exact training in colonial bureaucracy would unexpectedly provide Yap with the very weapons he needed to fight back. They taught him the grammar of power. But before he could even use those tools, his whole world was turned upside down. In 1942, the Japanese Imperial Army invaded. The British colonial apparatus that governed their lives vanished literally overnight. And that begs a critical question, one that every single person in North Borneo had to face. Who protects a community when the empire falls? The crucial takeaway is captured perfectly by an anonymous Panampamhang elder regarding those dark occupation years. They said, "The Japanese years taught us that no foreign master, white or yellow, would protect us. We had only each other." The sheer brutality of the occupation proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that indigenous self-reliance wasn't just some nice political ideal. It was the only way to survive. Part 4. Surviving the Dark Years. Part 5. The Power of the Pen. Looking back at that crucible of the occupation, Yap experienced the severe vulnerability of his dual identity. His Chinese heritage put a massive target on his back, as the occupying forces were systematically persecuting ethnic Chinese. And yet, it was the life-saving mutual aid of his Kadazan roots, the communal sharing of food, the knowledge of the forests, those tight-knit kinship networks that ultimately kept his family alive. Fast forward to after the war. Yap takes a job at North Borneo Timber. Here, he gets to watch exactly how the British colonial economy works up close. He realizes something huge. In this modernizing, post-war world, true power doesn't just come from owning the land. It lives in carbon copies, official records, and bureaucratic procedure. He realized that if his people were going to survive, they needed to organize formally. So in 1953, the Society of Kadazans is formed, and Richard Yap steps up as its secretary. He takes those exact skills the British taught him, and he weaponizes them to outmaneuver the colonial state step by step. Step 1. He kept meticulous minutes of every single meeting, transforming casual conversations into permanent institutional memory. Step 2. He mastered formal correspondence, writing letters in the exact bureaucratic idiom that the British respected. And Step 3. He drafted formal constitutions to legally legitimize their organizations. Think about what this bureaucratic approach actually achieved. He didn't fight with weapons in the jungle. He fought by drafting flawless petitions that the colonial state was legally forced to acknowledge. He kept incredibly scrupulous membership rolls to prove, on paper, that they had the numbers. He created a permanent institutional memory that could never be erased. And in 1956, he helped establish the Tuavan Clubhouse, finally giving the Kadazan people a permanent physical home for their governance. Part 6. Reclaiming a name. I want you to consider your own identity for a second. How does a government form define you versus how you define yourself? For decades, the British categorized the indigenous people of this region as Dusun. Now, this was a Malay word meaning orchard, and it carried a pretty demeaning colonial connotation, basically calling them rural yokels or simple country folk. It was an outsider's label. But Yap and his community, they knew themselves as Kadazan. This was an ancient word from their own oral traditions, meaning the people or the people of the land. So Yap used his role as secretary to officially document and formalize a unanimous vote to reject the term Dusun and permanently claim Kadazan. His relentless, highly documented advocacy, working alongside leaders like Donald Stevens, rapidly forced the government's hand. And the timeline here is just staggering. The society is founded in 1953. By 1956, they have their Tuavan Clubhouse built. By 1960, they successfully petitioned to have their sacred harvest festival, Kamatan, recognized as an official public holiday. And by 1961, having built this undeniable administrative foundation, they transitioned into a full-fledged political party, UNCO. These ultimate victories were incredibly concrete. Yap's meticulous petitions won legal native status and land rights for Sino-Kadazans, people who were previously completely ignored by the law. He helped secure the Pesta Kamatan state holiday, literally forcing the colonial calendar to recognize indigenous time. He successfully reclaimed the name Kadazan in the official record, and perhaps most importantly, he laid the bureaucratic and legal foundation for UNCO, completely unifying the Kadazan political movement just as North Borneo was heading toward self-governance. Richard E. Yap's story is an absolute masterclass in the power of the written word and the quiet, undeniable strength of administration. It really leaves us with a powerful and honestly somewhat unsettling question to consider today. Think about it. If the institutions that define you vanish tomorrow, do you have the records, the minutes, and the memory to prove who you truly are? Thanks for joining this explainer, and keep learning out there.